that devotion by itself, although it's beautiful, is really not enough in the tradition of Ramanuja. You have to have a good theology as well. And likewise, a good theology is not enough unless you have the practice that goes with it. And we see all of this enacted in the Nitya Grantham. There's also a number of places in the text where Ramanuja will say, stop for a moment and meditate. Again, contemplate the Lord's beauty, contemplate the great things that the Lord has done, contemplate all his divyadeshas. And there's a sense that meditation is not simply, as many people might think today, emptying the mind or trying to do vidyas from the Upanishads, but rather it's intimately tied in with being a member of one's tradition, worshipping Sri Narayana, and understanding how those meditations are part again of one's practice. So I'd say about 6 or 7 times in the Nitya Grantham, there's this anusandhana. There's like, stop, having meditated. Then you can speak directly to the Lord. Having meditated, you can put yourself at the feet of the Lord. Having meditated, you can imagine the Lord saying, Bhagavan Eva, the Lord alone does all of these things. And there's a sense that meditation is not something you do over here, and ritual practice something you do over here, but they're together. And again, so many people in today's world said, I don't do rituals, I meditate. And I think Ramanuja is reminding us, why do you have to choose? You do them both together. Another element that I was interested in learning from this text, and again, I'll only mention it briefly, and I'd love to talk to some of you about this, is the use of the mantras in the Nitya Grantham. And a number of kinds of mantras are mentioned. Very few of them are given, but there is an Astra mantra, the Astra mantra that is used as a kind of raksha or protection. That mantra is mentioned. Then there are the 5, the Panch Upanishad mantras. And they're actually given in the text. They're actually given at one point. And I don't know much about where these came from. They don't look to me to be directly from the Upanishads. But nonetheless, that these mantras are used in the course of the ritual. One remembers the Lord's creative power, his shrishti, the samhara, the taking apart of the world at the end, evoking the Lord with these 5 mantras. Again, for any of us who are interested in ritual performance and the use of mantras, it's wonderful to see in the Nitya Grantham so compactly how these are being used. And of course, there's the Dvaya mantra, which is not actually quoted here in the text. Only at the end, as I said before, it says, as has already been explained, you now do your prapatti. But as in the Sharanagati Gadyam, the Dvaya mantra is not actually given. But there seems to be a sense that when one does this pranam, when one does the ashtanga flattening on the ground, kurmavat, like the tortoise on the ground, all of this is the spirit, the enactment of the Dvaya mantra. And again, to see, the Dvaya mantra is explained at great lengths by somebody like Sri Vedanta Deshika in the Rahasyatraya Saram, of course. But also simply to see as part of the life of the devotee, one has the Dvaya mantra before oneself at all times. But most prominent in the Nitya Grantham is the Mula mantra, the Tira mantra, the Ashtakshara. Because this, I think, is used about 15 different times. It comes up in the course of the Nitya Grantham. It's used sometimes as part of an abhimantrana, this kind of addressing the Lord, address the Lord, evoke the Lord, evoke his retinue, honor the place, Tiru Mula Mantrena. And so by this mantra, one is able to interact with the Lord and his retinue more easily. Another way is, and I may have misunderstood this, but it seems in the text there's a kind of nyasa, where you kind of place the Mula mantra onto the parts of the body, onto the head, onto the navel, onto the hands, onto the feet. And this seems to me extremely interesting, maybe in terms of the Pancharatra background, but also just in terms of the physicality, that when you do your ritual, you don't forget that you have a human body, but rather the Tira mantra is actually a way of sanctifying your body. and you kind of recite the mantra and go through yourself all the way to your feet. And it's a very physical kind of application of the mantra to one's life. And also a number of times, and again there are 15 mentions or so of the Tirra mantra, it is by the Tirra mantra, the Mula mantra, you do your prapatti, you surrender, you give yourself to the Lord. And again, I'm not ready yet to say why doesn't he say by the Dvaya mantra? But it's always in this text, the Mula mantra, by the Mula mantra, which is maybe known to him more clearly at this point, one makes one's prapatti. So it's very interesting to see how the world of mantras comes alive through looking at this work. Another point that I would make would be the sense of what exactly is this text putting before us in terms of who it is who practices it. This paramaikanti, or as he also says at the beginning, Bhagavat Kaimkarya Eka Rati, the person whose only rati, whose only pleasure is in service of the Lord. Now, so many people I've talked to, both in the States and even some of you recently, said, God, we don't have time for this. We don't have 3 hours every morning to do this Nitya Puja, as Sri Ramanuja puts it before us. So what exactly is the person that Ramanuja is putting out here? The first thing is, I think, this text seems to be, this is the worship of the person who is paramaikanti, the person who's totally focused on the Lord already. And I think even for Ramanuja 1,000 years ago, this would be a very small group of people. This is not every Sri Vaishnava should be doing the 3-hour puja every morning. Don't feel bad if you're not doing it. But rather, this is for the apex, this is the climax, this is the highest point of the worship. And what strikes me about that is not, if you do this a lot, you will become paramaikanti, but rather, this is the way you live your life when you reach that point. And I think the difference there is very important, that it shows this is an expression of the life of the person who has realized the presence of the Lord. It's not a ritual that you do to get there. It's not a kind of bhakti yoga that you do this, you do this, you do this, you do this, and then you get there. But rather, if you are this person, you live entirely this way in this world of mantra and meditation in the presence of the Lord. One of the texts that seems to be implied in this passage, and I think Rita Adlori already brought it up this morning, was from the Bhagavad Gita chapter 7. Tesham Gyani Nitya Yukta Eka Bhaktir Vishishyati Priyohi Gyanino Atyartam Aham Sacha Mama Priyaha. This person who is the most beloved of the Lord, this one who is most priya to the Lord. And this seems to be echoing through the text in terms of, if you are this kind of person, in addition, or maybe aside from your karma yoga, jnana yoga, bhakti yoga, this is part of your domestic life, the way you live. And the reason I single out this verse from the 7th chapter of the Gita is because it comes up again in Ramanuja's work when you start to read backwards. If you know the Sharanagati Gadyam, it quotes from the Bhagavad Gita about 7 or 8 times. And these verses together, like 7:14, 7:15, 7:16 of the Gita, are quoted together in the Sharanagati Gadyam. And it comes up there, but interestingly, it also comes up at the very end of the Vedartha Sangraha, and the very end, surprisingly, of the Sri Bhashyam. And right at the end of both works, when Sri Ramanuja is summarizing what is the Vedartha, and when he's finally saying this is the true meaning of the Upanishads as in the Brahma Sutras, he finds occasion to quote from chapter 7 of the Gita. And again, this is interesting to me because in some ways, again, when you start at the end at Nitya Grantham and read backwards, you begin to see that the thread running through it is this idea of the ideal person, the paramaikanti, as expressed in the Bhagavad Gita. And then when you start looking for it, you see it's all over the place. His works have this idea deep inside them of this kind of final, perfect person. So what I would say as I draw to a conclusion, and I've just been touching on points that I hope of some interest, that once one begins with, rather than not getting to the Nitya Grantham, once you begin to read backwards, you begin to see things about the works of Ramanuja that you would not otherwise see. And I think one could spend a long time talking about the relationship between the three Gadyas and the Nitya Grantha, because I think they go together. If you only have the Gadyas, what do you do with them? A lot of words. The Nitya Grantham shows you where you do them. But what is the spirit, what is the eloquence of the Nitya Grantham? It is in these three Gadyas, and they go together. But even more challengingly, why does Ramanuja bother to do his Gita Bhashya, his commentary on the Brahma Sutras, his Vedartha Sangraha? I think it's in order to create a world intellectually, and I think Ram Prasad was talking about this morning, to create a world intellectually in which one is able then to say, this is the right thing to do if you are Paramaikanti. All the obstacles can be removed. There is no understanding of the world that makes this impossible. There is no higher state of Brahman consciousness in which this puja is no longer necessary. But rather, if you understand the tradition properly in all the different shrutis, you realize it creates a situation in which one finally is this kind of person who can worship in this way. And while there are many, many things to be said about Sri Bhashya, Gita Bhashya, Vedartha Sangraha, at the core of it, I think, is to say the man who spent all his time doing this intellectually brilliant exegesis is also the man who's saying, and this is all for the worship of this Paramaikanti. The last thing I'll say is that when I started, I said I was thinking of two alternatives about what to do in this presentation. Nitya Grantham, or all those little itihasas of Yam Perumanar in the Bhagavad Vishayam. And I think someday I'll go to the other part of it and talk about the Bhagavad Vishayam more, because I was going through it using Professor Venkata Krishnan's big book of all the itihasas from the Bhagavad Vishayam. And I counted up, if you go over the 4,000 pasarams, there are about 80 different verses in which Ramanuja is quoted or referred to, or some anecdote is told about him. And while this is not going to be another Ramanuja, the secret life of Ramanuja or something, it shows him not so much proving anything about his knowledge of the Prabandhams, which we know he had, I think, but rather what was his interaction, what was his disposition in dealing with these texts. And I think opening that door will be very important. And I'll just give you one example and then I'll stop. In the Mudal Tiruvandari, one of the first 100 verses of the Alvars, at verse 44, there's a beautiful verse that opens up many things in the tradition. I'll read you just the English. Whichever form pleases his people, that is his form. Whichever name pleases his people, that is his name. Whichever way pleases his people who meditate without ceasing, that is his way. That one who holds the discus. This total availability, this total saulabhyatva of the Lord, who is able to be as you name him, you see him, you relate to him. In the context of commenting on that verse, Periyavachan Pillai tells a story of Ramanuja that I'm sure many of you know, that he's walking in the precincts of the temple at Sri Rangam, and he sees some boys who've been playing at being priests. And so they've drawn in the dirt on the ground this image of Sri Ranganatha. And they're pretending to be priests and bowing and so on. And when he comes up to it, he sees what the boys are doing, and immediately he prostrates himself in front of it. And when they ask him, why did you do that? These are just boys fooling around. He says, the reason I did is because of this verse, Mudal Tiruvandari. Whenever people see the Lord in this form, practice him in this form, I am there. And Ramanuja said, I am there too, at his feet. And so in that light, if you look finally at the third line, whichever way pleases people who meditate without ceasing. And that's in the Tamil, and Ramanuja is referred to in Periyavachan Pillai's commentary, seems to be, in a sense, in essence of what the Nitya Puja is about, the Nitya Grantham, worshipping ceaselessly all the time. That's why it's Nityam. And I think what that does is to say that when you become this Paramaikanti and you're totally focused on your meditation, it doesn't close the door and build a wall around you, but rather it opens you up so that, as we would say in my tradition, you can see God in all things. You see God in your puja in the morning, and then the rest of the day, even when boys are drawing in the sand, you see the Lord and you worship him there. And that is why we talk about Ramanuja as a staunch Sampradaya devotee of Sri Vaishnavism, but also as a figure for the global world in 2017. Thank you.
About a couple of years ago, my late friend, when we were discussing the issues surrounding the metaphysics, issues of Jiva and Paramatma and so on, he raised, he is no more today, and on his behalf, I'm raising this question. He asked a very penetrating question. Can a Jiva occupy multiple bodies at the same time? And this question I've asked several scholars as well before, and they gave me a mythological answer and theological answer to that, which I'm not satisfied at all. I would like to have more epistemological, logical answer to how to address this issue of can a self occupy multiple bodies at the same time, and how it can be, is that consistent with Vishtadvaita Vedanta? I think not. I think it's just so. I have my own opinion on that, but I would like to raise this issue fundamentally to the scholars of this conference.
Thank you. Should I answer? Yeah. So thank you for raising a question that really doesn't relate to my paper, but nonetheless, I would say that although there's this very interesting question about multiplying many or inhabiting many bodies, what the Nitya Puja shows is that you can do beautiful worship in the particular body that you happen to have, and that this body is for this era, this birth, enough. Now that doesn't answer your question, but it also says having multiple bodies would not be better necessarily than just having one body.
Okay, this is a broader question, because you talked about words and practice going together, and words I understand as theology and philosophy going together. And also people, this morning I think professor from Lancaster, he talked about conflict, Ramanuja being as a conflict resolver versus, I can't remember who it was, versus resolving conflict. But this is a broader question, particularly from the institution that you come from, and you're a comparative theologist. How should we as humanity, you think, based on your comparative studies and your background, and also your background, in your scholarly background, should reconcile, given the history of the church, which was involved in genocide of Native Americans up to like now in Rwanda, and the issues like child abuse, and even before that, inquisitional issues in India and also in Europe, how Christianity spread. So isn't there a conflict? How do we reconcile?
Yeah, I think there's a conflict if we imagine that if our sense of devotion to our own tradition is such that we think my tradition is beyond criticism, my tradition is perfect, my tradition is the best of all traditions, you're going to get into terrible conflicts when people point out history to you. But I think what we need to do is, on the one hand, be 100% realistic about the good and the bad of how people of my tradition, your tradition, any tradition have treated other people, both as individuals and societies. But also not allow that to say, well, because of the Inquisition or because of child abuse, therefore I have nothing to learn from your tradition. Rather to say, mixed in with the bad is an incredible good as well. And to be realistic, but also to say, if you look deeper, you can look into the practice of people like Sri Ramanuja and say, look at the beautiful things that were done that prevented the religion from becoming bad on a larger scale. And I think you could look the same into the Catholic.
From yesterday onwards, this question keeps coming up time and again, whether Sri Ramanuja belonged to tradition or whether he is a revolutionary or a reformer. I think the best way to see him is to think of him as if he is expanding the world of tradition. Now in this context, I think this Nitya Grandham is very, very important. This yajna is confined to a few, whereas this Nitya, this Thiruvaradhanam, is very similar to yajna. It is the same. But in the case of this Thiruvaradhanam, everybody is an adhikari. So that way he is able to bring it to everybody, this involvement directly in communion with God. So in that sense, he was I will not put it as he is a revolutionary, no doubt, but he was able to expand the world of this tradition to involve everybody into that. And along with that, you also mentioned that Moola Mantram, this mantra Diksha is given to everybody. And Moola Mantram is recited as part of this Thiruvaradana. The third point that you mentioned in some other context also, in Vayettu Vaalvirgal, this I makes a very interesting commentary that to think of him is to converse with him. And later on, when you translated Nambil, I think, to think of him is to meditate upon him. Now, when you do this in Brahma Sutra and all that Upanishad, it is some sort of an impersonal God. When you come to Gita, it's much more personal. But when you do this Thiruvaradhanam, it is very close relationship you are establishing with him, incorporating the entire thought into the entire thing. So I thought I would just.
Thank you very much.
Sir, it's basically two questions, but very brief ones. First one is regarding this Nitya Upasana that is done in Ramanuja Sampradaya. The one that is done externally, is it also practiced internally in the same manner? That is one of them. And secondly is regarding the secrecy of the practices, because in many traditions, a particular set of the practices are maintained secret, especially the mantras and the nyasams. Is there any part of secrecy that he has discussed that this part should not be revealed to the public or like that?
Yeah. Okay, okay.
Well, we all know that the physical body is active almost throughout the day, and therefore it needs relaxation. And we all know that we have the physical body relaxation in the form of sleep during night. Well, apart from that, we also have the subtle body, the Linga Sharira, which is active even when the physical body is inactive. But the Linga Sharira also needs relaxation. One of the best techniques of relaxing the subtle body is to engage the mind in the Nitya Puja.